Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the January 2025 meeting of the Bay Area Culinary Historians. This evening, we are presenting Richard Foss, speaking on the first California cuisines. Richard has been writing professionally since 1986, when he started reviewing restaurants for a Los Angeles newspaper. He has contributed to over 40 different publications, including the Encyclopedia of World Food Cultures and Oxford Companion to Sweets. Richard has taught culinary history in extension programs, done lecture tours in the US, Australia, and New Zealand, been a culinary consultant for museums, and is on the board of the Culinary Historians of Southern California. His book on the history of rum was published in 2012. Food in the Air and Space was released in December 2014. He is the executive director of Collage, a place for art and culture, a nonprofit arts center located in San Pedro, California. Please join me in welcoming Richard Foss.
I'm going to imagine some thundering applause now, and just assume that that's happening in your living rooms or wherever you're watching this. Thank you very much, Andrew and Carrie. What this program is an introduction to two cuisines that once dominated California and now are almost completely lost. I composed this while I was working as a culinary consultant to the Autry Museum of the American West here in Los Angeles. And I felt that this had to be done as a program because I found it so fascinating that something could have been so successful at one point in history and then just disappeared. Now, first of all, I want to go into what everybody knows that's wrong. Anyone who goes to school in California is typically taught about the native diet in America, and they present the native diet in America, which they say is corn, beans, and squash. And the thing about that is interesting is none of those things are native to California. Corn never came across the desert, never came north from Mexico. It was eaten just about everywhere else in the United States, but California. California had a native squash called Cucurbitae californiensis, but that squash is basically inedible. It has a tiny, thin skin of rather bitter fruit over a very large nut. The native people actually took the seed inside and grated that and used that as a seasoning, but they did not do anything with the fruit. And as for beans, they basically weren't here. It's another thing that was to the south, to the east, not in California. Now, when you talk about what was eaten in California, you have to consider that the ecologies in California are so remarkably different. If you look down at the very south and east, you have the Colorado Desert, which, as forbidding as the Colorado and Mojave may seem to modern people, there were native people who thrived there. And if you look up to the north and west, you have the Klamath North Coast, which is a cool rainforest. There is nothing that grows in that southern area. Crabgrass won't grow in that Colorado desert, whereas there's nothing that grows there that also grows in the North Coast. And in between those things, you have alpine, coastal, Mediterranean, all kinds of different climates. So when it is absolutely wrong to talk about, the food culture of the native peoples of California, because as I put here, ecological diversity forces cultural diversity. There are a remarkable variation also in different soils, from volcanic in various areas, desert sand. You have just so many different situations among all of these. The native people had staple crops in different places, and I'm going to go into those. The main ones were acorns, cattail roots, pinon nuts, mesquite berries, and each one of them, what they do all have in common is they required considerable food processing. Of these, the most widespread in the coastal region was the acorn. And here you see an image of someone gathering using the traditional type of basket that was used for acorns. The native peoples of the California coast were fantastic at weaving baskets, and they had a wide variety of different things that were available to weave them from. So they made baskets that can hold water. They made baskets that were very tough and stiff, and you see one being used here basically as a backpack. The oaks that produce these acorns grow across a wide range from the coast to the Sierra foothills. Now, all acorns are not alike, but it's safe to say that most of the ones that grow in California, they are extremely tannic, acidic, bitter, and inedible when raw. To eat them, you had to actually take them and wash them. The way that they washed them was by putting these acorns, after removing the shells, they put the acorns in a basket and let it sit in a slow-moving creek or river, and left it there for days in order to wash some of the tannins out. They then ground them, and then they were available to cook them. The cooked acorns were, excuse me, either made as a kind of stew called chamuk, to which they could add a variety of different vegetables, or they were sometimes prepared in a way where someone would build a fire and then they would build a fire on top of a flat rock, get the rock very hot, and then sweep the ashes away and essentially use it as a griddle. Um, the chamuk is a word that is probably from the Pomo language. Another item that was a staple cropped, storable food were pinon nuts, which that looks like somebody with a basket full of pine cones, and that's because what it is. The pinon pine of the coastal ranges and into the Sierras has very large edible nuts. You're probably calling them pine nuts. You probably have some that were the variety imported from China. The American version is actually larger and more flavorful, but they take a huge amount of handwork to harvest. You have to actually pull the individual seeds out of a pine cone. And that is something that is very, very time consuming. So a child in a native family was going to be expected to spend many hours a day probably just pulling the seeds out of pine cones so they have these pinon nuts. The regular pine trees, all of those seeds are edible, but in most cases are not worth the effort. Pinon nuts are large enough to be worth the effort, and they're very healthy. They're very high in fats and calories, but there's one problem with them. Some years you get an extremely good harvest, other years you get nothing at all. Nobody knows why, and you can't predict it. So pinon nuts are something that, because of the fact that they can be stored for a very long time, as long as they're still in shell, you can just keep on harvesting them from the ones that you've put aside. But they're a more chancy thing than acorns, which you have in any year. Another edible seed of the southern coast and the deserts is chia. Now, here we see chia in its natural habitat. Oh, wait a minute. I think that's the slightly unnatural habitat that was popularized by the chia sculptures and things. Um, I do not have to pay royalties to Bob Ross or the people who made chia pets for these. I checked. Um, Now, chia was used by native peoples. It's a very tiny seed, but relatively easy to harvest, and it was used for both food and medicine. And it has beneficial nutrients and is also very high in protein. When roasted, the seeds have a nutty flavor, and I use them in all kinds of different things. I toast some chia seeds in a frying pan usually, and I will toss them in with Brussels sprouts, cabbage, other green vegetables, and they add a delicious nutty flavor, and they're high protein. Now, when you take the raw seeds, and put those in water, they become very glutinous and they become something like an herbal milkshake. Dried chia seeds were sufficiently nutritious that it was noted that native people who were messengers, while they were running from place to place, would have a bag of chia seeds because they would eat them while they were on the move. Other than this, the native people lived on seasonal plants, the bountiful fish and game that was almost everywhere, and among other things, on edible insects. Now, most modern people from a dominant culture have a very negative idea of edible insects. If you see something like grasshoppers, a lot of people are repelled by them. But you know what? Think of them as land shrimp. Why? Because they are. What are shrimp but an edible water-going insect? If you have had dried grasshoppers and you have had the dried shrimp that is a staple in Asian markets and cuisines, basically the same thing. And whether or not you have ever had grasshopper soup, which was a favorite delicacy of the inland native peoples, you know what color it is. Why? Because there is a lake in California that is named after this. You see, grasshopper soup is a bright, luminous green. The name for grasshopper soup is Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is named that because someone at one point came over a ridge and it looked like the world's largest bowl of grasshopper soup. Now, I mentioned drying. The natives actually ate these fresh rather than dried. As far as we can tell, native California tribes never developed the technique of salting and drying meat and fish to preserve it. They didn't because they didn't have to. In most of California, game is so available year round that they just didn't need to. So that's a little bit about the native diet. Suffice it to say that this was a diet that had worked for 10, 20,000 years. They found a way to feed people with plenty. They found ways of making it flavorful using wild leeks and onions, by using various other herbs in the environment. They did not use chili pepper, they didn't have it. But they did have some plants that are similar to cress that had that little sharp flavor that you could add into it. So they had an interesting and flavorful diet. Now, along come the Spanish, and they turn everything upside down. The Spanish claimed California partly to keep anybody else from getting a settlement that might threaten Mexican commerce. They didn't really want California very much for its own self, but after they got here, they discovered that this was a climate close enough to that of Spain that it was very good for two things that they really wanted, which were grain and grapes. And we'll go into why and about that whole situation in a minute. So the Spanish began a rather feeble colonial enterprise. They never put a whole lot of work into making California habitable or interesting or give them a robust diet. The missions are the symbol of the Spanish domination of California, and this is the way the Spaniards like to portray the missions, with the native people reverently absorbing the lessons of the missionaries. Well, let's just say that that's not even close to what happened. When you look at the missions, you expect a huge population because of their size. Look at that building. I'm going to ask people to kind of guess in your mind. Look at the size of that building, and from the horsemen in the foreground, you can guess how big it is. And guess for yourself about how many Europeans lived there. The answer is that the population of the mission was supposed to be 3 monks and 20 soldiers. The rest was slave quarters for the native people and storage for food. The upper floors of the mission were more often used for food storage than anything else. So what the California missions were, as I say, it's a prison and a warehouse with a church attached to it. And it was the center of the community used to feed both the civilian population, which was tiny, and the soldiers. And I mentioned that it's supposed to be 3 monks and 20 soldiers. Very, very frequently, they were shorthanded because nobody wanted to come to California. California was a punishment detail. California was the furthest place in the world away from Spain. Now, you might say, well, no, it wasn't. There's further places away on the globe. But in terms of travel time, to get to California, you had to go all the way around South America or all the way around Africa. And to go all the way around South America and all around Africa, you were passing places that the Spanish knew had a variety of spices, that had gold. They had pepper from Asia, cloves, mace, other spices over which wars were fought. And California had nothing that the Spanish desperately wanted. There are no spices native to California that were used by anyone but the native peoples. So as such, the Spanish built these missions. Now, since they were here, they moved very, very quickly to destroy the native food culture, to suppress it in any way possible, to destroy even the memory of how to survive. And they did that because of the fact that they wanted to keep it so that if anyone escaped, they were not able to survive. So the native people were given one day of relative freedom, which was Sunday. And this image shows the an image in from the it was engraved by a Frenchman showing an image of the California people at a mission on the one day when they were allowed to do their native dances, which you see them doing to the center right. At the center left, you see them sitting in a circle playing a native gambling game. And the other thing that they tended to do on this day was recreate as best they could items from their own cuisine. Spanish records are very, very fragmentary, and they weren't very good at record keeping in Spanish California anyway. But we know from English ambassador in San Francisco, George Simpson, that he was disgusted that the native peoples on Sundays still tried to eat their own traditional cuisine. He did not understand the importance of maintaining your culture by maintaining your own cuisine. So visitors like British Captain George Vancouver, French explorer La Perouse were repelled by the food the Spanish did give to the natives because they gave them a diet of basically very, very little meat. They were keeping them relatively weak. They were keeping them as slaves. And these are the people who were growing the food for everyone else who were having to eat basically the same gruel every day. And it was not highly nutritious, but it was the only thing the natives were allowed. Now, the Spanish brought with them the European grains that they preferred, like wheat, barley, and oats, and also vegetables like carrots, cabbages, brown onions, and eggplant. They also brought vegetables from the Western Hemisphere that hadn't previously been cultivated in California, such as tomatoes, potatoes, corn, and chili peppers. Important fruits included apples, pears, lemons, oranges, and grapes. And the grapes were of a type that the Spanish sent out with every ship that they sent to places that they did not know. Every colonizing ship had some plantings of the Listan Negro grape. The Listan Negro grape is not a particularly good eating grape, and it's a fairly poor wine grape. So why did they send Listan Negro? Because Listan Negro will grow in St. Augustine, Florida, where it's hot and humid. It will grow in Cuzco, Peru, where it's dry and cold. Listan Negro is an incredibly rugged grapevine that will make fairly nasty wine everywhere. But they had to have wine because of the fact that as Catholics, it was one of the sacraments of their religion. So as a result, they kept on growing this wine, growing these grapes that made rather bad wine. Go into that after a little bit more. Now, incidentally, had the Spanish gone further inland than they did, they would have found better land for both grapes and grain, but they didn't. The Spanish occupation of California, though they claimed all of California, they only occupied the area within about 20 to 30 miles from the coast. The furthest inland Spanish mission settlement at Soledad is only 30 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So there's all of that California that the Spanish never even touched. What the Spanish did value were cattle. Excuse me, I forgot about this one. I mentioned that the native people were spending time in the fields rather than in the church. If you walk into the San Gabriel mission, turn around and look up, you will see this mural that was made during the Spanish colonial area. And if you look, it looks like grape trees. What it was actually was the Spanish would plant fruit trees, and then they would plant grapes next to them so that they could trellis the trees, they could trellis the grapes up onto the trees. And so here in the church, you see the native people doing what they were really doing most of the time, which was working as field laborers. I mentioned the cattle of California. The Spanish incredibly valued California because it was better cattle country than Mexico and than any place else in the Western Hemisphere, with these broad plains close to the ocean. If you look at the entire Mexican Pacific coast, it is jungle or desert by the ocean. And then they get to California, here's a place where cattle can thrive. Now, one of the things that you might note here, uh, if you know anything about traditional and historical costuming, the person who drew this did a beautiful job of getting the look of the California vaqueros. And he got a view of them doing something that everyone recorded that was quite dramatic, which was going out and roping cattle. Why did they have to rope cattle? It's because cattle in California were wild animals. They were just turned loose. They had no stalls at the missions for keeping cows for milk. There was no milk in California. The cows were all out in the fields. When you wanted one, you had to rope them. And the person who got this, we would have a little more faith in the accuracy of his drawing if it wasn't for the fact that this was drawn by someone who lived in Scotland and never visited California. However, he got most of this really right. He got the look of the California mountains. He got the look of the California missions. He got the look of the vaqueros. But I'm going to ask you to look at that cow, particularly the head. You can tell he was not in California because this is what they really looked like. They were longhorns. And that's the one mistake in what was otherwise a very well drawn image. Now, the thing about longhorns can protect themselves. A couple of longhorns can take on a bear, and often had to in California. So this was the type of cattle that were typically grown in California. The problem with them is that these Mexican longhorns, uh, they give really tough, really poor meat. That was okay with the Spanish because they were not really raising these animals for the meat. They were raising them for the cow hides, the beef tallow, and the bones and the hooves. The cowhides, of course, because they needed leather. Spaniards of that period wore leather armor, they had leather boots, leather cuirasses. Leather was sufficiently expensive that ships from California, as noted in Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, went round trip from from Boston to California, often with no stops in between, sailing all the way around Cape Horn to get to California to load up a ship with cow hides and cattle hooves and then go back home. Um, we know a lot about the taste of this beef and the quality of this beef. One of the things that I found most amusing was someone who was a preacher who was taking a ship around uh, Cape Horn, and that ship had stopped in Acapulco, and they had picked up some of these cows, and he said that he really was concerned. He said that members of his congregation use the name of the Lord in vain so very often when trying to cut through this meat. So we have something about what it was probably like to eat this stuff. Nobody willingly eats these for meat nowadays. So California, here we have this anomaly. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cattle, but as a general thing, no milk, cheese, or butter. And the animals this was bizarre. Foreigners were shocked by this state of affairs because when people killed cows, it was weird. California is the only place in the history where beef was the food of the very poor because it was free. When the Californians killed a cow, they would take the tenderest parts of the cow, the tongue, the head, some of the other very tender meat, and they would leave the rest of it in the field to rot. Now, since to get one steak you have to kill a whole cow, in the rest of the world, you didn't to serve veal was something that was an honor in the rest of the world because you're killing an animal that otherwise could grow up to be used as a work animal that you could get the hide from. In California, you just killed them. It didn't matter. So Californians ate jerky as a travel food. They cooked using beef tallow rather than olive oil, again, because it was free. So in California, traditionally, the real old California recipes were cooked using beef tallow. Alfred Robinson, an American who moved to California in 1829, noted that all California products except hides and tallow and soap were in need of a stable market. for they fetched prices too low to pay for producing them. Concepcion Arguello, daughter of Governor Jose Dario Arguello, said of California in 1806, a beautiful country, a warm climate, lots of grain and cattle, but nothing else. And now, I'll admit, she was a 16-year-old at the time, and if there wasn't a 16-year-old who complained about the town they grew up in being boring, they weren't really a 16-year-old. So, that's it can be taken with a grain of salt, but really, California was grain and grapes and cattle, and that's what the that's what the Spanish cared about. Now, there was one thing about this that's really odd, something that I left out, which is in much of the world, the food of the poor is fish, and Catholics are supposed to eat it on every Friday and during Lent. But despite California's long coastline and good harbors, California had no fishing fleet. Why? Because the Californians never sent any boat builders over. California had no native fleet at all. They had rowboats and rafts. And as a result, there just wasn't a fishing fleet to go out and get fish. The Pope gave Californians a special dispensation to eat beef on Friday instead of anybody sending out the boats for a fishing fleet. And this is why California also was so limited in their trade. There were no boat builders in California, which meant that if a ship doesn't happen to come through from somewhere else, a farmer has no idea whether and when they will be able to sell whatever they grow. So there is no incentive for farmers or winemakers to become efficient about what they're doing. A ship might wander in, British, French, Russian, or Spanish, even though the British, French, and the Russians were technically smuggling, but a ship might wander in, but you never knew when. So the San Francisco Bay Area had plenty of timber for building ships, no shipwrights. California had iron that could have been used to make various things like the anchor chains, but there was not a single person who knew how to smelt iron in California during this period. So they were left without these things that you have everywhere else. Now, the Spanish also brought pigs and chickens. They esteemed eggs very highly, used them in a lot of recipes. Sheep were raised mainly for wool, but we do have a few reports of people eating them. What everybody really loved, though, was an item that you can barely get now, which is the California quail. That little bird is about as close to completely spherical as you can get and still fly even for a couple of feet. And it was what everyone found delightful. They can fly fast for short distances, but have very little stamina. So if they get stuck in a net, they can't get out. The native people used to string nets between two trees and then creep along, basically hurting the birds, and then make a noise to scare them. And then all the birds would fly in the net. You wrap up the net, and you're having quail that evening. So foreign visitors praised the birds highly. They noted they were a welcome change from meals that where there were 10 dishes on the table, but 9 of them were beef in different sauces. One of the things that was not native to California that Californians came to love was chili peppers. And we have a description of a meal in California from Alexander Markov, who visited San Francisco in 1845. And I'll mention one of the best sources I've found for food, excuse me, the best source, contemporary source for food in early California is from the Russian expeditions that came to California to buy grain and take it back to their Alaska and Siberia colonies. And the Russians, man, the Russians talk about California like a real estate agent trying to sell something. They just talk about how great California is. Here's Markov, who was a naturalist who visited California, translated into English, of course, because you don't want to listen to me, try Russian. Making breakfast. A worker lights a small fire in his hearth and begins to make breakfast, grinding corn, and from its flour makes a kind of flat cake, something like blini. Well, of course, a Russian sees someone making a thin pancake. He doesn't know the word tortilla. Of course, it's blini. He cooks some small pieces in a pot, adds butter It wasn't butter. It was undoubtedly really beef tallow, but he didn't know the difference. Beef tallow looks like butter. Adding butter, salt, and such a large number of chili peppers that for the unaccustomed it is impossible to swallow one bite without a strong pungent sensation. You will not find stoves here. You will encounter them among the very few only, the reason not being a shortage of bricks in California, for the inhabitants of this blessed land think that it is better to prepare food under the open sky. Well, you can imagine how someone who comes from Moscow and spent time in Siberia would be gaga over the idea of a place where you can cook outdoors all year. And for a long time, it was thought that there was no single image of cooking in California. I found one and shared it with other culinary historians, and it's from a really, really weird source, which is it's not the British, French, Spanish, Americans who you might expect. It's from a guy who was Swedish, who, as far as I can tell, was the only Swede to come to California during the Spanish colonial period. His name, we don't know his actual first name, we just know his initials, G.M. Wazirts av Zandels, and he was an orphan in Sweden. At that time, the King of Sweden used to tell all the schools, send me the smartest orphans in all of Sweden. I will pay for their schooling. I will pay for them to become literate, and then we will send them out into the world, and they will come back to Sweden, and they will tell us what they have seen, and they will write books. And so as a result, these people were called the king's orphans. And the king's orphans, one of them was Wazirtsev Sandels, and here is the image that he sent in 1843. Now I'm going to, this is zoomed out. This is the whole image. And as you can see, they're sitting in a kind of lean-to that doesn't close on one side. To the left, you can see a haunch of some animal that is hanging. Now I'm going to go in a little bit closer. This is the part that is really, really interesting and highly significant. First of all, you can see a woman using a metate to grind corn. You can see another woman sitting next to her, and they're both wearing the mantillas, the traditional head scarves of Spanish California. And the one on the right is actually, as you had to do to use a metate in this way, she's sitting on her haunches because that gives you more strength to grind downward. You couldn't do this just on the table. You needed to use your body strength. This is actually a rather low position in order to be using a metate. The more physical strength you can push downward while you're grinding, the better. It's the woman on the right who is doing something that is really interesting, which is if you see that tortilla that she's patting out, look at the size of the tortilla and her hand. That's a really big tortilla. The reason that I mention that is it's extremely hard to get a tortilla that you can hand pat of that type if it's a corn tortilla. Corn tortillas don't have the glutens to stick together very well. This makes us wonder whether this is truly a corn tortilla or whether this might be either a flour tortilla or a mix of corn and flour. Because California in this period in 1805 is where we find the first unequivocal mention of a flour tortilla. So that could be the first image of a flour tortilla. Now we have the two gentlemen who are here, and the one on the right is doing something interesting which I found also only in Wazirts of Sandels. He mentions that the soldiers used to take the ramrods from their muskets and use them as barbecue skewers. And I have never heard of anyone doing this anywhere else, but it seems like, well, of course they did. They had a perfectly good barbecue skewer, a metal barbecue skewer with them at all times in a country and in an era where metal was very, very expensive. So of course they would use their ramrod as a barbecue skewer. Now, what did they use to drink along with this? Because you can see some cups in here. They were almost undoubtedly drinking wine because wine was the everyday drink of everyone. Foreign visitors noted approvingly that though Californios, including women, drank very regularly, it was very rare to truly see someone drunk. Now, one of the things I found surprising is I thought, well, here they were growing oranges and lemons. Surely they made sangria. But the earliest mention I've been able to find in California of sangria is from 1846. And that was that it was something the Californios were serving to French visitors because the French didn't like California wine. The Californians liked their wine just as it was, but the French wanted it mixed with fruit juice. That's not what I would have expected. Russians also remarked about the availability of locally made brandy and the occasional availability of rum and gin. There was also, in the late period, some whiskey, because as foreign commerce started up, California had a lot of grain. Once grain starts to rot, well, they could make beer out of it. And once you had beer, you can distill the beer and make whiskey. So the Spanish population in California remained very small, even after 250 years of settlement. In the history of Spanish California, Charles Chapman estimated that the non-indigenous population of the state, the whole state, at 3,270 people in 1820. And that includes 500 soldiers and the monks at missions. So the population was centered in San Diego, Monterey, and San Francisco, with villages at Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, plus some scattered missions, ranchos, and what were called estancias, remote outposts. So with so few people over so wide an area, all producing the same goods, there's no trade. So there's no monetary economy in California, very little to speak of in food, and food is all California produces. Now, with the arrival of sailing ships unpredictable, you don't have the ability for food exports. And when ships did arrive, there was a rush to buy spices and the luxury items they most esteemed, cookware and chocolate. Cookware, because California had no place, they had to work in clay most of the time. So if someone could get a metal cookpot or metal utensils, those were prized items. There are some of the ones that have been found from the California period that have been repaired again and again and again because they had blacksmiths here with enough skill to repair them, but not enough to make them. So, as for chocolate, a monk who was at the remote San Miguel Archangel mission wrote a plaintive letter to his monks at Mission Santa Barbara begging for chocolate, saying, "If I run out of chocolate, nobody will come visit me." I think he had a vivid idea of exactly how much people wanted to go talk to the priest at this remote mission. So, this is the situation you have in California. The towns, mostly very poor. The people on the vast ranchos lived like medieval lords in prosperous isolation. The hospitality of the ranchos became famous. And in Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mass, there is a vivid description of a party called a fandango. Now, this Mexican fandango by Ezequiel Iriarte is not actually from California, it's from northern Mexico. But the description in Richard Henry Dana's book is describing the very same thing. One of the things Richard Henry Dana was very dissatisfied with was the music, because he said that everywhere he went, the music was just guitars and a harp. And he went to a fandango expecting that there would be much better music, and there were more guitars and harps. That's really what they had. Um, and I ask you to look at this beautiful, large banquet hall. It's not a banquet hall. Look at what's hanging right in the middle there. That's horse tack. That's a saddle and stirrups. This is somebody's barn. What you're looking at, the famous Spanish fandango, we would call a barn dance. So California, well, California, I found it interesting that where near us, there's a place called the Richard Henry Dana Middle School. There are streets named after Dana. Dana hated California. He was bored out of his skull. He was a Yale educated scholar and who decided to take a couple of years working as a sailor. And he came here and he had disdain for the Spaniards and everything Spanish. He fixated on being scandalized by how flirtatious these Spanish dances are. Look at those women's ankles. Look at their lower legs. Are you not scandalized? And he recorded nothing about the food at the Fandango because he was at the table with the other sailors and they just got a bunch of beef and they didn't get the delicacies that were at the other tables. Well, what caused all this to fall apart? California had been chaotic before the era of the Napoleonic Wars, and during the Napoleonic Wars, things went completely wrong. Because during the Napoleonic Wars, the only trade California, the legal trade in California, this was a colony. Your only trade is with the mother country, with Spain. And during the Napoleonic Wars, when the Napoleonic pretender to the Spanish throne did not control California, he didn't send any supplies. Soldiers went 10 years without being paid, and eventually Mexico takes over California. Once Mexico takes over California, rival Mexican governments send rival governors. So California is ripe to fall when the Americans decide they really want it. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the system was unstable, though in a few places a fragile prosperity still held. One of those was Santa Clara. And here's how Santa Clara was described by Markov in 1845. Each house stands some difference from each other. Gardens are cultivated between them with cabbages, turnips, onions, cucumbers, and mustard, and there are also empty tracts planted with nothing. Behind the pueblo stretch orchards with apples, pears, bergamot, olives, plums, cherries, and grapes. Beyond the orchards lie clearings and fields of pumpkins, cantaloupes, and watermelons. The bright bay completes the picture. All around there is a profound stillness, and everywhere there is that carefreeness that generally distinguishes all the residents of this blessed land. Markov loved California. That description was from 1845. This picture is from 1856, and it had changed a lot by then. But that image is as close as we have to the natural look of Santa Clara from this period. And the Spaniards strived to get something like that peace and tranquility all over California, sabotaged by being governed from hundreds, thousands of miles away. That slow-moving, peaceful existence is encapsulated in this image, another textbook image that tells you how great the mission period was, but was wrong. But it serves as a picture of that elusive goal. Well, the gold rush caused the collapse of the California culture, both to the swindling of land from the inhabitants and the fragility of their society. Those sturdy longhorn cattle that the Spanish and Mexican Californians raised were replaced by much meatier, much more tractable cattle brought in by the Americans. And the economy that was based on exporting hides and tallow is replaced by a commercial economy. California becomes a capitalist system instead of the very rigid system that it had been before. And the diet is forgotten by almost everyone. The Spanish had suppressed the diet of the native peoples. The Americans didn't really have to try very hard to suppress the diet of the Spanish. It fell into disuse because very shortly after America took California, Americans outnumbered the old Californio families by dozens to one, then hundreds to one. One person saved the recipes. She was only 3 years old when America took over California. Her name was Encarnacion Pinedo, and she wrote a book that was called El Cocinero Español. And most of the book was cribbed directly from a Mexican cookbook. But there are a couple of sections that have recipes that are definitely from California because they have ingredients and methods that were not used in California. The book Encarnacion's Kitchen, which was by Dan Strail, is the definitive book for cooking California style if you're trying to make any of those old recipes. Um, there is a Facebook group called Alta California Food and Cookery. It's not wildly active, but there are some people who have read this and other sources and try to recreate those. There's also a resurgence of interest in native cuisine, and the first dining experience in California based entirely on native cuisine, Cafe Olone, opened in 2019. I went and visited Cafe Olone one of the times when I was up there to visit Carolyn Tilley and some other members of the Bay Area culinary historians. So I was able to go and experience this Californian diet. Now, will that come back will the true California diet come back as something you can find in restaurants? Almost undoubtedly not. Why? Not because people aren't interested in it, but because the ingredients are foraged ingredients. They're hard to find in many seasons. You have to cook with the seasons, and at the times when the native people would have cooked with their stored food, you have a real problem coming up with something that's attractive to restaurant diners. Cafe Olone was open for a couple of years and closed during the pandemic, unfortunately. There are some other people who are incorporating native cuisine into other cuisines or having specialties based on native cuisines, but I know of no other restaurants in California that are entirely based on this. That native cuisine is interesting, and it's something that we should all be studying more because of the fact that in the warmer, drier California of global warming, we need to eat the plants that are water-wise and that grow in our environment. So I encourage you to look into the native California cuisine, to talk to the people from the Ohlone, there are Salinan Ohlone and some other Ohlone who occasionally do culinary events or culinary programs. I encourage you to find them. I encourage you to involve them. And I encourage you to learn from them because it's a really interesting cuisine that cuisine of the past that may be a viable cuisine into our future. And so here's a little bit of recommended reading. I mentioned California Through Russian Eyes, which is oddly enough from the University of Oklahoma Press, but they have a lot of the best California history books out there. And California Through Russian Eyes is a treasure. It is the best single source for contemporary pre-American California. A Sojourn in California by the King's Orphan. It is a rare book and difficult to find, but if you're a California historian, you just must read it. Diary and Copybook of William P. Hartnell. That's free online. William P. Hartnell was a Catholic who went from mission to mission. He was an inquisitor, not the bad kind of inquisitor. He was someone who went to basically check how well the missions were running, how the books were being kept, etc. And this is his diary of walking from mission to mission. And it's very, very useful. And then the most readable of them, Life in California During a Residence of Several Years in That Territory. So I have a website at richardfoss.com if you are interested. I also am involved with another thing, which I'm just going to mention. We do culinary programs as well as other programs in Southern California, a place called Collage, a place for art and culture. Our culinary programs are infrequent. They mostly involve going into a restaurant where I've arranged a menu and we arrange for the owner to come out and talk about the culinary culture in between courses. So you learn not only about the food, but about politeness at the table, festival foods, etc. Another thing Collage does, and it's off topic, but it's really important to me, so I'm going to mention it. You've heard about the fires in Southern California. Collage is collecting musical instruments of all kinds, refurbishing them, getting them new cases, and then donating them to people who lost theirs in the fires. Because a lot of student and professional musicians alike lost their instruments, and every little bit that we can do to help them, we do. If you live in Southern California and have an instrument, please contact me. If you have money to donate to that cause, please look us up at Collage, a place for art and culture, because that's what I'm spending a lot of my life doing at the moment is trying to help people. And I regard that as really important. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions now.